Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the American Academy tonight, despite this uncomfortable weather situation. My name is Victoria Scheibler, and as Senior Counselor to the Academy, I would like to welcome you tonight to the Anna Maria Kellen Lecture, The Magician's Mother, a story of coffee, race, and German culture, held by Veronika Fuechtner, Chair and Associate Professor of German Studies and Associate Professor of Medical Education at Dartmouth College. The evening will proceed with an introduction to Professor Fuechtner and her work by Berlin-based writer and journalist Mrs. Tanja Dückers, who also has kindly agreed to participate in a discussion with Professor Fuechtner after her lecture, after which there will be time for questions from the audience. Before the evening, we'll finish with our traditional reception. Tonight's lecture is named after the late Anna Maria Kellen. She was born in 1918 as Anna Maria Arnhold in Berlin, and in fact enjoyed this house here as her childhood home before the family had to leave. Mrs. Kellen passed away in 2017, but her passionate philanthropic support of the American Academy has been a cornerstone of the institution and its programming. More than a dozen outstanding literary people, philosophers and historians have come to the Academy here as fellows in her honor. Now, please allow me to give a special warm welcome to Tanja Dückers, writer, journalist, poet, and literary scholar. And what an ideal combination, also a chocolate connoisseur. Tanja was born in West Berlin. After an extended stay in the United States, she read German studies, Dutch studies, American studies, and art history at Berlin's Freie Universität and at Amsterdam University, graduating with an interdisciplinary dissertation on the aesthetic of the sublime in modern painting as seen in the work of Barnett Newman. During her studies, she worked for Deutsche Welle TV in Berlin and as editorial assistant for various publishers. Her first two books, twin volumes of poetry, were published while she was studying, and her first novel was published after she graduated. Since then, Mrs. Dückers has established a career as a freelance writer and journalist. For example, she has been working for the weekly Die Zeit's online version since 2008. She has published more than 17 books, among them the novels Himmelskörper, Spielzone, Hausers Zimmer, as well as a couple of essays, poetry, plays, and children's books. She's been invited as a writer in residence, for example, to Dartmouth College, where I guess you have met, and among others to Oberlin College, Allegheny, Miami University. It's a long list. She has been invited to scholarships and teaching jobs around Europe and outside of Berlin, but Berlin is her home base. And she has written about Berlin. Berlin is her favorite subject, and she lives here with her family. And not to forget, in 2017, she turned her passion for chocolate into establishing the chocolate brand Preußisch Süß, means Prussian sweet, together with the chocolatier Christoph Wohlfahrt. And this means 20 different flavors, and which means they created a special kind of chocolate for almost each of the different Berlin districts. But I hope for this evening now that we can put the Academy on the chocolate map, finally. So what about a Wannsee-flavored chocolate? But thank you for coming, and the podium is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome also from my side. I'm very happy that Veronika Fuechtner is with us, and please let me introduce her to you. Veronika Fuechtner is Associate Professor and Chair of German Studies, as well as Adjunct Associate Professor of Medical Education at the Geisel School of Medicine, which belongs to Dartmouth. And to give you a little impression of the interdisciplinary nature of her work, she told me that last fall she held a seminar together with colleagues on the topic of doctors under National Socialism. She's also frequently discussing ethical questions with her students. Veronika Fuechtner is also teaching comparative literature, Jewish studies, as well as women's and gender studies. Let me also mention to you that she served on the steering committee of Women in German. Veronika is the author of a wonderful book, Berlin Psychoanalytic, from 2011, and she is co-editor of Imagining Germany, Imagining Asia, as well as a global history on sexual science from 1880 to 1960. Her research fields include the history of psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and sexuology, as well as the relation of science and culture. She's very interested in discourses on race and ethnicity, also a topic tonight. Then Weimar Germany, contemporary literature of the 20th and 21st century, German language literature, as well as German film and global German studies. A very wide range. Veronika Fuechtner has received numerous research grants. I'm not going to name all, otherwise I would be talking for a long time this evening, but let me mention just a few. She received a research grant from the American Psychoanalytic Association, the Deutsche Schiller Gesellschaft, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, as well as, this is a bit of a tongue twister, the Social Science Research Council. And of course, she is now the fellow here, the Anna Maria Callan Fellow of the American Academy, and she's completing her monograph on Julia Mann and on Thomas Mann's concept, his construction of race and Germanness. So I'm very happy to welcome you here and to listen to your lecture.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction. Thank you to Victoria for hosting the evening. Can you hear me okay? Also in the back there? Okay, good. I wanted to also thank the American Academy. They're really fantastic people working here. I'm so grateful to all of you. And you've been truly welcoming to me and my family. And it's an honor and a privilege to be able to write here. So I'll jump right in. What I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to jump a little bit around in the book that I'm writing, and I'm going to show you some archival material that I worked with and connect it to some of my arguments. And then later in the discussion, we can go deeper at any point that interests you. But before I show you some of this material, I wanted to introduce you to Julia Mann, because not a lot of people are very familiar with her, even if they are familiar with her children's writing or her grandchildren's writing. So Julia Mann was born in Brazil as Julia da Silva Bruhns. She was the daughter of a German immigrant and a Brazilian woman. She grew up on a coffee and sugar plantation in Paraty, which is south of Rio de Janeiro, which was then the imperial capital. She was raised by African and Afro-Brazilian slaves. The formative event of her life is when her mother dies, when she's almost five. And she describes how she remembers one of the last things. Her mother is lying dead, and on her chest is placed a dead baby that she died giving birth to. And The father, after the death of his wife, decides to bring his children to Lübeck to be educated under the care of his mother and his brother. And so the family crosses the ocean with the nanny, Anna, who I will be talking about more, when Julia is barely 7. She arrives in Lübeck. Her dark face, her yellow dress, and her white Panama hat draw so much attention that a throng of jeering kids follow her through the streets. She doesn't understand a word of what is being said, and nobody speaks her language. She's inconsolable when her father and Anna return to Brazil, and they leave her and her sister in a boarding school. She has to learn German. She has to become a Protestant. She has to like the German food, which is a challenge. Then at age 18, she enters in a somewhat arranged marriage to the merchant and later senator Thomas Johann Heinrich Mann. And she has 5 children. 2 of these children are very well known, Thomas and Heinrich Mann, well-known writers. So her husband dies when she's 40. And this leads to dramatic changes in her life, changes in social standing, and also to a dramatic move. She moves to Munich, to southern Germany. She writes her memoirs in 1903. And these memoirs, I'll be talking about them a little more too, are kind of an urtext of the family. I think of it as an urtext. They describe Brazil as a childhood paradise. They describe her traumatic history of immigration, the tragedies of her life. And she describes this succession of tragedies. Some of these tragedies are in her memoir, her father's death in particular, her mother's death. Some of them are not. Her daughter's Carla's suicide, which she witnesses, her sister Mana, who dies a few years later. All of these are losses that she experiences. Her children describe how Julia Mann always longed for what she considered her homeland. She's a passionate mother. She's very connected to her children until her death in 1923. And her youngest son, Victor, describes how on her deathbed, her last German words suddenly assume the accent and melody of her origins. So this is an image that I took from Dagmar von Gersdorff's recent biography of Julia Mann, which is the only existing biography of Julia Mann. It shows her and her sister Mana in the boarding school. She's kneeling in the front. And I wanted to give you a little bit about this background of Julia Mann, because my book is actually precisely not a biography of Julia Mann. It's actually a reflection on how her biography has been dealt with, particularly in relationship to the work and legacy of her son, Thomas Mann. You could say my book traces the biography of a biography. And this is a kind of meta-biography, which leads me to a political critique of the way in which the German language literary canon is constructed up until today. Given that Thomas Mann is one of the most studied German authors, it is simply stunning that the critical potential of his Brazilian background remains largely unexplored. Biographical readings have been crucial to his legacy and the scholarship, for example, in regard to sexual difference, his attraction to men, the construction of Jewishness, the Jewish origin of his wife, but not this story. And I think part of the issue here is that Thomas Mann himself was not very forthcoming about this part of his life, particularly before exile. And so before the Weimar years, when he mentions this story, he usually frames it in terms of Latinity. And I think this term Latinity is very interesting because it actually Europeanizes this Brazilian story. And it displaces it onto a European South rather than a global South. And I would argue that this term Latinity manages the associations, what Brazil could actually mean. So miscegenation, indigeneity, slavery, the world of colonialism, and in the case of Brazil, the world of empire. So my book tries to bring in scholarship on race and migration to argue that this Brazilian background not only matters, but it is central to Thomas Mann's work and to his place within German literature. And this is actually something that Thomas Mann himself stated later in 1930. So in an interview with the Brazilian writer Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, he said that he saw his mother's origin as central for understanding his own and his brother's Heinrich's work, more so than all his European literary influences. More so. In lectures, I have thus called Thomas Mann Autor mit Migrationshintergrund, an author with migration background. And like just now, usually people in the audience laugh when I say this, because it seems incongruous. And I think this perceived incongruity points to the fact how loaded and problematic this term actually is, Migrationshintergrund. So why is this term associated particularly with younger contemporary authors who might even be German native speakers born in Germany? What are the unspoken assumptions about cultural, and I would argue also implicitly racial, homogeneity of the German literary canon? So with this question in mind, let's dive into the archive. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Julia Mann's father, Johann Ludwig Hermann Bruhns. And I would argue that while Julia Mann is busy becoming German, he's busy becoming Brazilian. So he emigrates to Brazil in 1840. He becomes a Catholic. He learns Portuguese. He changes his name. He becomes João Luís Germano Bruhns. And he builds a network of sugarcane and coffee plantations, eventually becomes an imperial delegate. He's close to the Brazilian Emperor Dom Pedro II. And for a while, he actually resides at the Brazilian court. He marries a Brazilian woman, Maria Luisa da Silva, and he has 5 children, the fourth of which is Julia. They speak Portuguese at home, and that's different from many German immigrants at the time who maintain a German language household in Brazil. When his wife dies, as I mentioned, he drops off his children in Lübeck, but he himself returns to Brazil and continues his adult life there. He marries a second time, and much to Julia Mann's chagrin, he marries his cousin and his sister-in-law. So his brother's wife died, and shortly after he marries his brother's wife. Julia Mann's aunt, Emma Bruhns. In some ways, he repeats family history. He leaves his nieces in the same boarding school that he left his daughters, and then takes Emma Bruhns to Brazil and her baby son, and they continue their lives in Brazil. They eventually move to Italy, and Bruhns retires in Kassel, where he dies. Julia Mann visits him there, and she also attends his funeral. But the point here is that he lived most of his adult life in Brazil for almost 4 decades. And through him, Brazil was very much part of the family. Thomas Mann was 18 when his grandfather died, and this story was not just present in Bruhns, but also in his aunts and uncles, particularly Mana Bruhns, the sister of Julia Mann, later Mana Stolterfoot, and other family members that went back and forth between Brazil and Germany. The document that you see on the right side here is actually an application for citizenship, for Brazilian citizenship. It's an application for Bruhns' nephew, Karl Ludwig, so the nephew that then he adopts as his son. It says, I, Bruhns, as a Brazilian citizen, sponsor this Brazilian citizenship application, essentially. And I think this document shows you that the Brazilian South and the German North were really thoroughly connected spaces. People would go back and forth. There were migrations and remigrations. This is a story of what Stephen Greenblatt has called radical mobility, so a condition which was constitutive for cultural production even before the globalization processes of the late 20th century that we think of now. Let me move to Maria Luisa da Silva, Julia Mann's mother, Bruhns' first wife. And so that's Thomas Mann's grandmother, right? And when Bruhns marries her, she has absolutely no connection to Germany. I think that's really important to note. And what interests me here with her is the question of how ancestry is actually constructed in the Thomas Mann scholarship. Because on the one hand, Maria Luisa da Silva is usually described as Portuguese. She's a da Silva. And thus her daughter, Julia, is presented as Portuguese German in a way. And so this construction is actually one of European whiteness. And usually the way this is done is that the da Silva family is followed to the immigration from Portugal to Brazil. And this follows some of the family's own construction of ancestry. And it also shows what you could call the power of patrilineality. Just the male figures here are important, the da Silva figures are important, but what happens on the maternal side is actually, maybe not that relevant, but it is. On the other hand, so she's often described as Portuguese. On the other hand, she's described as Creole. And this is actually a term that Thomas Mann himself uses, that is picked up in the literature of the time and is completely unfiltered in the scholarship up until today. And I want to make the point here that it is really problematic to use a historical racial category from the 19th century that is filtered through scientific racism, essentially, without commentary in scholarship on Thomas Mann. And it's a very, historically, also very unclear category. What does Creole even mean? In the Spanish colonial context, it means one thing. It's like descendants of Europeans, but that's not entirely clear either. And then in the Brazilian context, it means criollo. It relates to the history of African slavery. So how is this used here? And I think we have to understand this term Creole as part of a management of the kind of anxiety around the racial origin of Julia Mann. So I tried to read the Mann family records thinking about these questions, and to be sure, a project of tracing Julia Mann's racial otherness in the archives runs the danger to reaffirm fictions of race that are couched in the language of biology. Race is a fiction. Racism is real. However, I found it worthwhile to make the point that these fictions of race don't even hold up to their own framework of evidence. So I wanted to show you here in the slide the baptism record of Maria Luisa da Silva that I saw in a small parish in the area where Julia Mann grew up. And I knew that this record existed because I had seen a transcript of it in the Thomas Mann papers in Zurich. The Mann family had requested this transcript from the German consulate in Rio de Janeiro in 1937, while they were already in exile from Nazi Germany. And this record is used, the transcript of the record is used in the scholarship alongside other family narratives. But it's actually a very problematic and very contradictory record. And I'm not going into the weeds of this here, but my main point is that on this family record we find a lot of saint names that were commonly assumed in baptism by indigenous people or by African slaves. So Teresa de Jesus, Francisco de Paula. So that according, if you want to go by this record, there's a very high probability that Thomas Mann's mother had indigenous and probably African, or possibly also African ancestry. And at least indigenous lines up with some of the narratives that are around in the family itself. And we also know historically that the area where Julia Mann grew up, Costa Verde, is the area where the da Silva family lived, was a very hybrid space. Where the influence of the Tupinamba and Tupiniquim tribes was very palpable. And these tribes were considered officially extinct already in the mid-18th century, but they continued to make their presence felt. And they had adjusted their traditional way of life, they intermarried, they participated in the colonial economy, their own land. But moreover, the indigenous language, Tupi, made its way into Brazilian Portuguese, and it made its way into Julia Mann's autobiography. So in her autobiography, Julia Mann mentions Tupi words such as mingau, porridge, or tucano, toucan bird. And many elements of indigenous spiritual life become part of Brazilian Catholicism, the religion that Julia Mann was initiated into, the belief in spirit nature, the idea of rebirth, the notion that dreams are predictive of the future, for example. So there's another aspect of this record that I want to briefly touch on. if you look at the Da Silva line, if you want to look at the Da Silva line, you could also think about how this relates to the history of mass immigration of Jewish converts to Brazil in the 16th and 17th centuries. Da Silva was a very common Marano name, and the Portuguese heritage of the Mann family could also link to European Sephardic Jewry. And I think here the implicit assumption in the scholarly literature underlying descriptions of the Portuguese in the Da Silva family is an assumption of a homogeneous and monolithic European Christianity. But Europe is not just Christian. So to some extent, the actual family history, as far as it can be traced in the archives, doesn't matter for my reading of the place of the Manns in German literature. What truly matters is that the idea of racial miscegenation, of mixture, was experienced as very real in the Da Bruhns, Da Silva, and subsequently the Mann families. It was both a fantasy and it was also a threat. And I think it's really important to understand Thomas Mann's own silence about some of this Brazilian history, his earlier silence, not as a sign that it wasn't important to him. After all, we're talking about his mother, which is a central relationship of his life. But maybe we have to read the silence as meaningful. The silence could be understood as an effort to separate himself from this history, as an act of passing, and in his case, a very successful one. What are the stakes of that? And I think the stakes in Wilhelmine Germany are very high, and in Nazi Germany, they're higher. I wanted to read you this quote about Thomas Mann from the National Socialist newspaper Der Angriff from 1932. We have to require with all urgency that this writing mixture of Indians, Negroes, and Moors, and the devil knows what else, is not allowed to call himself a German writer. Here he drops once again the mask of the cultivated good German Bürger and proves in all clarity that Creole blood is coursing through his veins. So if you look at this quote, you get a sense that maybe a factor for choosing exile was not just his politics or the Jewish descent of his wife Katja, but that there was a real issue in terms of how he would be perceived in Nazi Germany. And I think in some ways exile changed Thomas Mann's view of this Brazilian history. There are quotes from 1936, for example, where he compares what he calls his drop of Latinity with the Jewishness of his colleagues in exile. And he construes this ultimately as a basis for being a cosmopolitan German. I'm going to jump back again to Brazil, to Anna. So this is an excerpt of a partial list of the slaves that João-Luís Germano Bruhns owned. And if you see this list, it's a partial list, there are more, it actually brings home the point that Thomas Mann's grandfather was a major slaveholder. And according to several sources, there are around 100 slaves that live on the Bruhns estate. And we know from local historiographies about the hardship of slave life in Parachi at the time. Many slaves suffered from contagious diseases, and even with good treatment, 5% of a plantation slave population would die within a year. The local laws of Parachi give you a sense of what it was like to live as a slave there. So there was an edict, for example, that prescribed a punishment of 25 to 50 lashes to those who left the farm grounds on holidays, Sundays, or at night. And even in the Mann family, the exploitation of slaves was noted. Thomas Mann's youngest brother Victor writes in his autobiography how the Da Silvas, Julia Mann's grandparents, liked to entertain their slaves with fireworks, but that the next day the overseers would, quote, get what was humanly possible in labor out of their black brothers on the sugar and coffee plantations, end quote. And I think it's really important to note here that Germans, while Germany was not seen as a slave-holding nation, that Germans globally acted as slave traders and slaveholders. And the violence of slavery became through goods, stories, and even personal interactions, like with Anna, a benefit and effect of life for them, including for the Mann and the Bruhns families. So on this page, you see the entry for Anna, the enslaved woman who raised Julia Mann. It shows her age, her nationality, she's from Mozambique, and her worth, 800,000 reis. Anna looms large in Julia Mann's memoirs, and with her slavery and slave culture. In fact, Julia Mann's nickname, Dodó, is a common Afro-Brazilian term of endearment, meaning small or lovable. Mann relates how Anna curled her hair to make it look just like hers, and how she taught her Negro songs, which she calls them Negro songs. Julia Mann continues singing these songs to her children and grandchildren, and Klaus Mann describes how they sound a bit risque to him. The Brazilian writer João Silvério Trevisan has pointed out the emotional significance of this song Molequinho do Meu Pai, which she frequently sang. And in this song, a young girl mourns the death of her mother, and she is then buried alive by her stepmother. It's a children's song. This song certainly resonated with Julia Mann, whose mother died, whose father left her alone in Lübeck, and who had to accept her aunt as a stepmother. But what I want to point here to is also that this song points to, and the emotional significance of it points to illegitimate sibling relationships as part of plantation life in 19th century Brazil. So in this song taught to Julia Mann by black slaves, the singer addresses a molequinho do meu pai, so my father's slave child. There's a lot of connotations here, my father's bastard child. So given that this song is so emotionally overdetermined in the family, I did want to point to the possibility that Julia Mann's father, Bruhns, fathered the child with Anna. And under Anna's entry, we see the entry for her daughter, Luciana, whom she had in 1855 at age 29, who is described as racially mixed, black and white. And Julia Mann mentions this important childhood companion in her memoir as the mulatto child, Louisiana. In some ways, it doesn't matter what the exact nature of Bruhns' relationship to Anna was, because the anxiety inherent in these sibling-like relationships comes out in the song. And that anxiety was very real. We know enough about Anna, about Luciana, from Julia Mann's memoir to make the point that they, and with them the complex negotiation of intimacy and subjugation inherent in slaveholding, were an integral part of the Bruhns family life over a long time, even after Julia Mann's immigration to Lübeck. We also knew that Julia Mann's view of race was shaped by an experience of deep intimacy, coupled with a sense of racial superiority. The slaveholding system was inextricably linked to violence, threatened or actualized. Those who were owned were separated from those who owned them by racial prejudice, including ideas that slaves were like children or animals. These ideas are also very present in Julia Mann's memoir. For example, in the way she describes a Negro, she calls a Negro, on a ship passage to Germany who entertains the children by acting like a monkey. So I want to say here also that Parachi is not just a childhood paradise that Julia Mann describes in her memoirs, but it's also a site of violence, and that comes through in different parts of the memoir. It's under the surface. And clearly the characteristics that are assigned to black slaves in the memoir threaten to shape Julia Mann's own image. And the text enacts the very anxiety it attempts to quell, the fear of contagion of racial primitivity. So the notion that Julia Mann needs to be civilized, infuses her own account of her education in Lübeck, which was to eliminate, and she describes this very precisely, the education in Lübeck was to eliminate the effects of her Negro education, including superstition and belief in magic, which is literally beaten out of her. I wanted to show you a page from the memoir manuscript. And the very form of the memoir, its handwriting, its corrections, reflect this forcefulness of this re-education effort in Lübeck. Because from a distance, she's over 50 as she writes this memoir, from a distance it grasps for the language of her childhood, and after almost half a century emerges the Portuguese of a child that was not yet formally schooled in her mother tongue. Moreover, the European languages of her musical education, Spanish and Italian, are layered over her Brazilian Portuguese. She writes Madre di Dio rather than Mãe de Deus, or Diabolo rather than Diabo. In other instances, Julia Mann researches and corrects her writing and adds explanations into the manuscript. So she adds, for example, the name of the dried meat that she frequently ate with the slaves, carne seca. And it's noteworthy that the German edition, the 91 edition of this text, actually makes some overcorrections to the manuscript and also omits the underlining and some of the exclamation marks that are in the text and make thus the text a lot less dramatic. It seems that the image of excessive Southern emotionality that Julia Mann herself narrated as part of her Brazilian story carried into the editorial practice of having to contain it. Ultimately, her memoir attempts to write Julia Mann as white and frames her re-education as successful, but the language still transports the anxiety around immutability of race and dangers of contagion, and is thus not entirely surprising that Thomas Mann blocked the publication of his mother's memoir during his lifetime. I wanted to show you another page of the memoir because it's a point where actually this notion of Southernness is positively connoted. So it's connected to musicality. And it posits Negro education, what she calls Negro education, as the origin of her, Julia Mann's, successes as a musical performer. So she reconstructs the melody of the song I already mentioned, Molequinho do meu pai. And then she continues in the manuscript. They, Julia and her sister Mana, sang in the nasal way they had adopted from the Negroes, but they held tone and pace firmly, and later they counted among the musically most sure in the choir. So the theme of musicality as a passion fueled by emotional and linguistic primitivity, while simultaneously providing access to the higher echelons of bourgeois education, not only resonates in the scholarly language about Julia Mann's musical talent, but also becomes a paradigm that informs Thomas Mann's writing on music. So if you think about the Northern and the Southern, the rational and the irrational, the primitive and the civilized, as really important points for his musical writing. So I think this points to my other argument that it's really crucial to think about the Brazilian in the Mann family, not just as constitutive of constructions of the racially, nationally, or culturally foreign or exotic, but as constitutive of constructions of the German, so particularly of how Thomas Mann conceives of the German. Julia Mann's memoir narrates her process of becoming German, from her painful struggles with German grammar and German dogmatism, to her enthusiastic embrace of German music and literature. So while providing a blueprint of what it means to become German, it also follows one, namely narratives of Jewish assimilation in the 19th century, many of which posit Schubert and Goethe as the apex of this process of becoming German. Julia Mann was a musical artist. She was an accomplished writer, an educated reader. She initiated her children into the cultural canon she had herself acquired through musical education and through book gifts. And I wanted to show you how she embraced this role of a mediator, an observer, and commentator on German culture, and commentator quite literally. So this is actually from a book that she gave to her oldest son, Heinrich. And this is next to a poem by Adalbert von Chamisso, der Sohn der Witwe. And the poem describes the extent of a mother's love for her son and her endless mourning once he dies. And so the mother's love is bigger than, the bride and the sister. That's, not as relevant as the mother. And Julia Mann writes next to this poem, "Ja, Chamisso, so ist es wahr." Yes, Chamisso, that's it. You got it, Chamisso. And thus coupling a cultural education with an emotional demand on her then 11-year-old son. So I wanted to give you this as an example, and there are many others in that vein, that this investment in German culture was an emotional investment, but it also went beyond, it was also an intellectual investment, and it went beyond a sense of appreciation of art and music's beauty that is so often ascribed to women with all its implicit intellectual limitations. Julia Mann regularly critiqued her son's fictions, and at times he sought her advice. So when he created a Christmas scene in the Buddenbrooks, she actually became the native informant for Lübeck culture for him. He was like, you know, what are these recipes and so on. She's a native informant for Lübeck. And it's significant that Goethe's work held a very special place for Julia Mann. She maintained a collection of Goethe articles and excerpts, a collection that provides a sense of the family's dialogue around Germanness as grounded in Weimar classicism and in the bourgeois humanist idea of the Kulturnation. Thomas Mann used this collection to work on his own Goethe-inspired novels, such as Dr. Faustus or Lotte in Weimar. And his personal, artistic, and intellectual investment in Goethe's life and work can hardly be underestimated. So these are just a few ways in which Julia Mann's narration and mediation of her own Bildung, her process of acculturation, are central to Thomas Mann's shaping of his own place at the center of the German literary canon. His grandson, Frido Mann, and other scholars have already pointed to Thomas Mann's correspondence with the anti-fascist Karl Lustig Briand in Brazil. So in 1943, Thomas Mann wrote to him that he considered Brazil his motherland, and that he was a German writer with Brazilian blood. Therefore, in conclusion, we could say that Thomas Mann's investment in the other Germany, the anti-fascist Germany, was closely linked to the Germany of an other. Thank you. I did want to show you, before we jump into the discussion, a picture of how the house where she grew up looks like today. I was there several times, and this is how it looks like. And we can talk more about it. Should we, yeah, we can.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your lecture. I'm very curious to read your book. Let me ask you, what do you think? Why did this racial view on the Thomas Mann family, this racial ideology, persist throughout the 20th century? I mean, after 45, after 68, and so on. What do you think are the reasons for this persistence? And connected to this, maybe the question, do you think there's a double discrimination at work, looking at Julia Mann being from Brazil and being a woman?
Yes and yes. Yes. I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think I'll start with that part.
Yeah.
I think it's just amazing that, you know, every figure in Thomas Mann's life has been so thoroughly investigated. And yet the mother, you know, just gets a wonderful biography last year. And so you have to ask the question why, and I think part of it is certainly this backstory, this challenge that is there also, and in the ways in which this story has been seen. I do think that I guess I do think there's not enough carefulness, and I guess what I'm calling for is carefulness with these racial descriptors. I think it's really descriptors like Creole or Portuguese, what do they actually mean? And I think it's really important to talk about culture. So, this was a Brazilian woman who came to Germany and became German, right? So what does that mean if we call her Portuguese or if we call her, her background Creole? It eliminates what Brazilian actually means. So I think there is a way in which these descriptors of race keep feeding into notions of culture that are unreflected in contemporary Germany.
And do you think that maybe there's a change at work, looking at the wonderful, very lively and informative biography you mentioned already by Dagmar von Gersdorff, which appeared in 18, and then also Friedomann's Mutterland from 2009, not to forget. I mean, do you think that there's a change and there's a growing interest in the multi-layered origins of Thomas and Heinrich Mann?
Well, I think this story could have been known if people were interested in it. I mean, there is work on this, right? There is work. Yahya El-Sage has, for example, written about this. There's earlier work about this. There's this Brazilian scholar, Paulo Soete. But somehow this discussion does not move into the center of what is Thomas Mann research or discussions on Thomas Mann. So I think, has it changed? I think there is more of an interest. There's some interest in this topic, right? And I think there's an interest in attaching to this story, and I think the people who know about this story become really interested and invested in it. I met so many people who were doing research on this, or in Brazil, who connected to the story in different places. So yes, it maybe hits a nerve now. Maybe there's more readiness for this story, but.
Let me ask you a somewhat a bit personal question. I mean, you yourself have a Brazilian mother, you have a multi-layered biography, you grew up in Germany, but you teach now for a long time already in New Hampshire. So does this help you, your own, from your maternal side, your biography, to help you to understand Julia Mann, or to...
I don't understand Julia or Thomas Mann any better than any of you, I think, because of my background. But I do think that it gives me first of all, I do think it gives me research tools that are useful. I speak Portuguese, I speak German, I speak English, and I could bring together different sets of scholarly literature that usually don't speak to each other. So that's certainly, I think, maybe the biggest plus here. I think I can relate to a history of immigration in so far as I can relate to the history of immigration that my mother had to Germany, which is a very different history. But I can certainly also relate myself as being a mostly German, socialized person who immigrated to the United States and experienced that process. So I can relate to these processes, but I think they're historically very different, and personally also, of course, always very different, what they mean.
Yeah. So. But you pointed out some things like with creating contacts, and you speak Portuguese. And a question now on the title of your book in Spe and on your lecture. You call it the magician's mother, but not Professor Anklins mother or the patrioteer's mother, Professor Unrat oder der Untertan. Why do you focus on Thomas Mann? I mean, do you do this because he said, where I am, there is Germany, so like he was like constructing this image of being German, but one could also argue that both brothers in their way thought or believed to be representatives of Germanies, different Germanies. Is this rather a bit of a catchy title? And in the book itself, you will explore more also on like Heinrich's concept of Germanness, or what about this?
I'm glad you like the title. but I actually do focus on Thomas. I mean, Heinrich, of course, comes up, but I find Thomas more interesting as a case because it's not as obvious. Heinrich Mann actually spoke, in contrast to Thomas Mann, more openly about this story. He used his mother's memoirs pretty much one-to-one, to write a novel zwischen den Rassen, between the races. He was very Latin identified, you could say. I mean, he considered Latin, French identified, etc. So I think he attached to the story in a very different way, and in a more overt way. And I think that's not the case for Thomas Mann. And I really wanted to use Thomas Mann to make the argument
it's not really the exotic that matters here. It's what makes her German makes him German. So that's really the trajectory that I'm creating, and I can use Thomas Mann for this better.
Okay, yeah. You criticize the canon formation of German language literature and that it neglects and hasn't paid so much attention of the works of immigrants. I mean, we don't consider, as you pointed out, we don't usually consider Thomas Mann to be a second-generation migrant. Do we?
We should. Günter Grass.
Yeah, I mean, you're right.
Elias Canetti. I mean, there's so many, that you could, if you want to go wild with that category, you know.
Yeah. It took us a long time. I mean, but do you think that there's also a change at work now? I mean, in the last years, many authors came from other countries and published here. Just let me name Abbas Kida, Lina Atwa, Khalal Al-Ahmadi, or also writers who have been here for a much longer time, like the Argentinian-born Maria Cecilia Barbetta or Sarah Chirac from Turkey. And there are also projects which are firmly committed to integrating refugee writers here. So do you think that there's also maybe an opening and a change in that respect that, like, could leave us a bit optimistic?
You want optimism? Yes and no.
Stance?
Yes, sure. I think yes. Obviously, I mean, there's an amazing richness in terms of writing from people who have other languages and migration experiences and so on. The question is, how are they perceived? And I think if you ask these writers, they all will at some point struggle with the notion, do they work with this category, Migrationshintergrund or Migrantenliteratur or so on? Do they use it, to work with? Do they distance themselves from it? How do they relate to it? It's definitely brought to them, no matter what. And so I think that certainly remains an issue. I mean, you could start thinking about German literature as multilingual, right?
Definitely.
Does it have to be just German?
Yeah.
Never was just German.
No.
Camiso, came from France. So I mean, I think it's important to break these categories.
But don't you have the feeling that this is an ongoing process? That now the little debate we have here, that it's discussed, like that it's questioned. What do we mean with these?
Yes.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of pushback.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's what I'm.
I agree.
If you.
Yeah.
I mean, just let me mention one nice project here in Berlin. An author colleague of mine collects texts written in Berlin in their in the mother tongues of the mother languages of the writers, and their books in 120 different languages being written in Berlin in the last years. So, and he's not interested in the translations, but what's written here in the original languages. So, and I mean, maybe there's a race consciousness, but. Very important question. Could you please tell us something about the reception of Julia Mann, of her life, of her fate, of moving to Germany, of this acculturation process in Brazil? How is she viewed there? And like, is there a large interest in her and her story? And
well, that's the thing. I think Brazilians had this story on their radar forever, right? While Thomas Mann was still alive, actually, and they start claiming him very early too. They're not shy about claiming people, and so for example, in the 70s, the Brazilian sociologist Vamire Chacon, he writes, "The magician is also ours." He's saying like he has a Brazilian sensitivity. The Brazilian writers like Guimarães Rosa, so they are related to Mann, and so they base this in notions of heritage and so on, but also in a kind of affinity, intellectual affinity. And so the story in Brazil is very present and well known. And you have Brazilian scholars who also work on this story.
And is there maybe the feeling that, in Germany, by literary critics, it's not viewed enough that Thomas Mann has from his maternal side this Brazilian roots. Is there a feeling of being like left out a bit or neglected?
Well, I guess it's seen as marginal, and I'm wondering why.
Yeah.
You know, to me it's not marginal, and to Thomas Mann it certainly wasn't marginal. So why is it perceived as marginal?
He even talked about his mother and the influence of her in his Nobel Prize speech.
It's everywhere. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, the Fazenda Boa Vista today, could you tell us something about Frido Mann, a favorite grandson of Thomas Mann? He has plans to establish some Casa Mann or so, and
it's a complicated and long and sad story ultimately, because this house, and you can see this to some extent, is decaying. It's a house that belongs to a private investor, and there were plans to turn it into a museum and into actually a residency program. But that fell through. It's a complicated, long history that fell through over many years. Frido Mann got very engaged in this, but I don't think at this point is anymore. It was just really painful. And but the house still exists, and it is private property. So you cannot actually visit it usually. It is decaying, and it's really sad. I think the town of Parachi actually, there are local historians there who cultivate this story. There's going to be a room actually in honor of Julia Mann that's will have some of the archival materials and so on that will be installed. That's in the works. So the story is very present there, but not in this house. So maybe it'll change, but for now it doesn't look like it.
So this idea of the Casa Mann as an intercultural center for German-Brazilian relations
it would be wonderful. I think it would be very appropriate. But there is a literary festival in Parachi which emerged as part of some of these activities, and that's very successful today. Yeah. Well. Can I ask you something?
Yes, of course.
So, I mean, we're talking about Thomas Mann, and so I maybe just one question. If you're, as a contemporary writer, what is his place for you? I mean, how would you relate to him?
Actually, I must say I do love the works of Thomas Mann very much, and I know that it's not necessarily usual in my generation. Like when I discuss with other colleagues, often they are very critical of Thomas Mann. But I started to read the Buddenbrooks when I was 14, and directly after Honey and Nanny, and my parents gave this to me. I'm sure I understood only half of it or a quart. But I was very touched by this Thomas and this Hanno story. And so, this first real book that you read is like a first love. So maybe
from Honey to Hanno.
That's actually true. And I really love his description of people and their inner struggles. And then being a teenager, somehow I could strongly relate to that. And now being a lot older, I still really adore the way how he describes people and sceneries with this, in this very special, ironic way. And I still love his books very much. But it's like a bit of a first love.
A lot of people say that, actually.
Really?
Yeah, when you ask them about Thomas Mann, it's a first love.
Yeah. I think now, it's this whole story of his family as portrayed in the Buddenbrooks, which is still my favorite novel. I think now, of course, I find it very interesting to understand German history, like 19th, 20th century. Yeah, so that's, and something completely different. But imagine, Thomas Mann was 25 when he finished the Buddenbrooks. He had worked for 6 years on this. And he finished that being 25 years old. I'm sure not only me, but most of my colleagues, we wrote our, like, you know, first books that we don't like to look at anymore at that time. So that's also quite amazing. I mean, these books are so rich in culture and like what you can learn so much. Yeah, but I would really like to open our conversation up. There are many questions, so please.
Thanks, Veronika. Very fascinating. However, I ask, did you find any traces of this background in the novels or stories of Thomas Mann?
Everywhere.
And if so, which ones?
Well, I think one book that I write about is Königliche Hoheit, which is in a way a story of two misfits who get married and who have one of them. I mean, so it's the Prince Klaus Heinrich. He has an atrophied arm, and Emma Spülmann is of what's described as Creole blood, you know, Creole origin and American origin, and so there is a discussion of what it means, you know, what race means. And you could read this this novel, Königliche Hoheit, as an answer to Heinrich Mann's Zwischen den Rassen. It really relates very directly. And while Heinrich Mann's Zwischen den Rassen ends tragically, it's about degeneracy and the tragedy of degeneracy. Thomas Mann resolves it actually where this kind of notion of degenery actually becomes the future of renovating this old dukedom, right? So it's actually a new motor for tradition. So it's everywhere. I mean, this is just one example, but it's really everywhere. It's in Buddenbrooks, it's in Dr. Faustus, it's everywhere. And there has been work. I'm not the first person to say that. There has been work about this, and it's everywhere in terms of, you know, signs of the exotic, but also signs of what it means to be German as a construction from the outside. So yeah, I could go on, but I'm gonna keep it short. Yeah. You wanna?
Yeah, don't.
I just wondered, are you writing this in German?
I'm writing it in English. Yes.
What?
I'm writing it in English.
In English?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. But I can translate.
Thank you. You describe the journey of becoming German, I think was the phrase you used about Julia Mann.
Yeah.
She was, of course, half German, but her father had inculturated himself apparently almost completely in Brazil. So my question is whether in the autobiography or in the rest of her correspondence you pick up any sense of her coming home as she comes to Lübeck.
No, not at all. The immigration to Lübeck is described as a complete trauma. It's really, really hard. In her autobiography, it's very, very difficult. Lübeck is a very foreign place to her. She describes the language, the experiences with people. It's not a homecoming at all. And she doesn't know her relatives, the relatives from her father's side at all. She has to get to know them. So it's not a homecoming, and it's never framed as that. And it's one of the deep experiences of loss that she narrates. She always comes back to that. So yeah.
There are two questions or three.
Thank you. Why, in your opinion, I mean, you mentioned it as a question, but why, in your opinion, has the non-Germanness of Thomas Mann been forgotten or maybe erased?
Why?
Yes.
That's a good question. I think, I think it was always there, and I think it also got layered in different ways. I mean, he also became American. I think that's something that we shouldn't forget. And there's also a lot of really fantastic work about that, his process of becoming American. And then when he returns to Europe, he returns to Switzerland. I mean, he doesn't return. I mean, yeah, he returns to Switzerland, so he doesn't go to Germany. And when you look at the, Hans Vager has actually written about this, when you look at the discussions in post-war Germany about Thomas Mann, there's a lot of suspicion of him as an American, right? So he all of a sudden is Thomas Mann the American, you know, and that suspicion is actually, in my view, also racially charged. So he's this kind of hybrid figure in many ways, and you know, so there is a sense of distance. When you look at some of these sources, it's kind of stunning to read this today. So I think it wasn't maybe forgotten, but it got layered and framed in different ways. That would be the beginning of an answer, really. There was another question. I don't see.
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned cosmopolitanism.
Where's the... I can't see you. Oh, here. Okay.
You mentioned cosmopolitanism.
Yes.
And I was immediately reminded of Zweig's own book about Brazil, Land of the Future, Landes der Zukunft.
Yes.
Now, do you think this multi-layered, multi-origin family narratives, whether or not they were repressed, whether or not they were allowed traction, is ultimately a quest for an alternative topos to Europe, an alternative utopian, if you will, place which could then suitably house these multi-layered, multiracial, multi-origin family trajectories? So cosmopolitanism as
a longing for...
As belonging, as a utopian site of belonging in itself.
I'm not sure I can answer this conclusively, but I think it's my instinct would be to say it's very different for Stefan Zweig than it is for Thomas Mann. I think I think there's this trying to keep it brief, but basically I think for Stefan Zweig there's this idealization of Brazil and of the mixture that Brazil represents to him that yes presents an alternative to a closing of Europe at that precise time, and I don't think it ever has that function for Thomas Mann quite the same way in this kind of ideal presentation, but I would have to, think this through more thoroughly. So, it's a great question.
Your lecture was called "A Story of Coffee." Will there be more on coffee in the book?
There was a lot of coffee involved writing the book, yes, there is a lot of coffee in the book, and I did not present enough coffee. But there is, I do talk about plantation life extensively, and I mean, you heard a little bit about the slave part. Actually, that's where it comes in. But about plantation, what it means to grow up on a plantation, the kind of who was around, what that site actually means, and so yes, That's the first chapter is really actually the book is Coffee, Race, German Culture. It's 3 chapters, and the coffee chapter is really the whole Brazilian background, the colonial or quasi-colonial economy of that links the Brazilian South with the German North and all of that. So that's why it's coffee. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much, Veronika, for this wonderful talk. I'm going to ask you a question crossing the Atlantic, as you probably expect.
Okay.
You said that he mentioned a drop of Latinity. Mm-hmm. And that really struck me, because there is an incredibly solid and long and studied and written discourse about Latinity across Latin America. And it varies from country to country. And there's a specific trait to which Latin America clings, especially at the turn of the century, which is to distinguish itself from the North. So my question is, in what sense is he using this drop of Latinity? What does this mean for him or for her?
So I wasn't sure. That's a great question. I wasn't sure whether he related to the Latin to the South American discourse at all. I'm not sure he actually I tried to track what he read about South America, actually. I went to his library and I tried to track what were the books that he had where he would have read about South America, and he would have, right? I mean, anyone would have in his shoes. And I think that discourse is not there in his, whatever his library was, what we can imagine as his library. But it's really more this kind of a Latinity as a concept that was developed to include also the French into this, the French, Portuguese, and Spanish as the Latin world, the European Latin world. It's really more that that kind of frame. So that would be my hunch. But yeah, that's a great question.
Just, well, a counter question. Could you imagine that somebody who did not have a Brazilian mother turned German would have written in the very same way as Thomas Mann did? It's kind of counterfactual, but I want to push you on this point, because not everybody who writes about, the exotic or the differences between a cold northern German upbringing and a warm Portuguese or Latin American upbringing has to know it, right? It's a trope.
It's a trope.
It's something that you find everywhere, and it's gratuit. And I just wonder how much of an imagination you put into Thomas Mann that he himself would have resisted to and say, well, lady,
he would have totally
you get me
resisted
completely
this.
wrong.
Of course.
But how can you, wouldn't you have to, in order to prove the point, and not just to assume and to invite us to think about these things,
I know what you mean.
Yeah?
Can I?
Yeah, of course.
So, of course, these were tropes that were around, the northern, the southern, etc. And there were many writers who engaged in those tropes. But what I'm trying to talk about is his investment in using these tropes, and also in his investment in constructing himself as German, and his investment in constructing himself as intellectually at the center of a discourse of Germanness. So that's really, I think, very special about his position in German language culture at the time. I mean, if you think of German authors of the 20th century who define Germanness, who think about Germanness, it's Thomas Mann, more so than many of his contemporaries, who would have all kinds of reasons to think about this. But I do think that this investment comes from that story. So that would be my...
In order to fend it off? Or?
Both. I mean, I think in the beginning, certainly, to fend it off. I mean, the quote that I showed you, the kind of suspicion of racial otherness was around. I mean, there's this...
That was 1932.
Right, but before too.
He did that in 1918.
Bartels.
I mean, he defined Germanness in 1918, in
before
1915, much more than in the later 1930s.
And that was around too. If you think about the discussion with Bartels about there's this sense that this accusation of Jewishness, right? And he fends that off. He says, I'm not Jewish with any. I think that he uses actually the term blood. With any part of my blood am I Jewish? He says, right? So there's a real anxiety around, and that's 1912. So there's a real anxiety around his makeup, and what is he in terms of blood? What is he in terms of intellectual? And that in that time that relates, right? The blood and the intellect, and so the anxiety is there. The fending off is there, and later the fending off is not so much there. It becomes something else. He integrates that story in a different way. So that would be my answer.
Thank you so much, Veronika. The more I listen to the discussion and to your talk, which is wonderful, I see a certain collision. There is a very strong political gesture on your side to think beyond race, to think beyond the construction of Germanness in a traditional way. But you are choosing an author who is very implicated in the racial discourse.
Yes, absolutely.
Be it with a drop of Latinity, which is also a drop of blood, because, you know, with the notion of race or half Jewish or whatever he's using. So the question is, how does one escape such a discourse? And one can, on the one hand, analyze what he's doing, maybe evaluating certain, quote, racial features more positively than others do, but at the same time establishing the idea of race. But how do you, as a critic, then go beyond it? And it comes at every point. There is the question of adjustment to Germanness. But what the heck is Germanness? You say Chamisso. Well, Chamisso is already taken aback. So you can play the same out with Goethe and other people who did not immigrate. Well, he immigrated to Weimar, but didn't immigrate to Brazil. Might have been as traumatic and was pretty traumatic to the burghers of Frankfurt to have him there. But what I'm trying to say is it's a question of fixed categories. And so my question to you is, how do you question fixed categories while at the same time operating with them?
That's a great question, Liliane. I think, I mean, what I'm trying to tell is a story of Germanness, right? It's not Germanness per se. I'm not saying Thomas Mann, you know, what Thomas Mann describes as German is German. I'm saying it's a story of Germanness that he tells. And I'm talking about his investment in this story of Germanness. So is it essentially German? No. I mean, I mean, you know, it's a story of Germanness. So that would be my answer.
One smaller detail. Is this story of Germanness so important because of his shame and feeling ashamed by it? But
feeling ashamed about Germanness?
No, the opposite. By being not this pure German, he imagined himself, perhaps, for him?
I'm not sure I would talk about... I'm not sure I would talk about shame in this instance, or that it was even that articulated in a way. I think it was. I think it was very clearly. How do you say in English? I'm losing my English. A Makel, a kind of, it was a question mark, it was a stain. And it's something that had to be negotiated in one way or the other. And I think, you know, this origin, the question around the origins had to be negotiated. I'm not sure I would talk about shame in that context. I think that it would be hard to have indications for that kind of emotion. But, yeah.
In the back.
Yeah.
Ganz hinten.
So my question is about you don't hear it. To talk in the mic, please. So my question is about interdisciplinarity, and you know, your project or your presentation draws a lot on archives, and so I guess my question is, how do you see yourself as a scholar? Are you more grounded in? Do you see yourself as a historian or working in cultural studies, or how does the interdisciplinarity fit? And particularly, I'm interested in how the interdisciplinary kind of drove your project in terms of, did you begin with the literary text and then you identified, oh, I see something here about Brazil that I want to go into the archives, or did you emerge in the archives and then go back? Like, how did you bring together the literature and the archival, the history?
It's a great question. I guess I started out as a scholar of German literature. and thinking about, how do we define German literature? What do we think of as a canon of German literature? So I think that was my initial question about it. And as I went into the archives, it became more and more also a historical project of thinking about how history is looked at, and not so much just looking at the history, but looking at how this history is being looked at. And I called it a meta-biography, but that's ultimately where I moved towards, and not just thinking about biography, but thinking about how biography is dealt with, how it's read, how it's deployed in different ways strategically, right? And in some ways you could say I'm a cultural historian also. But it's partly driven by the material that I found and that I could work with, but also by interviews with people who gave me great material about the story, like the grandson of Thomas Mann, Frido Mann, who I interviewed extensively, where you can think about, how does the story actually continue to matter in the family? And for him, it matters greatly. He wrote several books about Brazil. He went to Brazil. He wanted to make this a museum. So what does that mean, that the story continues to matter in the family? So those are some of the questions that I also that I didn't think about in the beginning of the project, but that I was led to continuing the project. So I guess I didn't start out as one particular type of scholar. I kind of let how the project grew kind of also determine some of the tools and some of the questions that I asked. So,
more questions? Okay, please.
I just have a personal question. I'm reading Thomas Mann's book, Der Zauberberg, at the moment. And does the Zauberberg also does it play a role in your research project?
Actually, no. I have to disappoint you. There are books. I think there are books that do zero in on Zauberberg as Paulo Soete has this great term, mnemonic alterity, that he uses to look at some of Thomas Mann's literature and think about it in relationship to the story. I think that you can make the argument that it is there, and it is certainly also there in Zauberberg, but that's not one of the books that I honed in on.
Funny enough, I read this book in Bahia under a coconut tree like that one over there, without having any idea what Germany was at that time.
Wow.
So absolutely far. And I had fantastic views of these mountains full of snow, how he was describing the whiteness. Yeah, it was in Switzerland. But anyway, I was approached him through that view in this landscape.
Right.
Thank you. And there was another question.
Yeah. Speaking about books, one should probably turn to Dr. Faustus and Adrian Leverkühn's mother and his host mother in his later Adrian Leverkühn's later life. I think it was Frau Schweigestill in Bavaria, and I think these are the women Adrian Leverkühn looked at the beginning of his life when he was born and raised, and at the end of his life. And the last woman he saw was again his mother, and these women are described in Dr. Faustus as a resemblance of his own mother, I guess. The other issue I want to raise, or a question I want to ask, is Thomas Mann could have emigrated to Brazil, but he went to the US. Any indication why?
That's a really great question. It's one that I asked myself a lot. And because particularly he was tracking his, the family was tracking the Brazilian story precisely in 1937. And Golo Mann, actually, his son, Thomas Mann's son, Golo Mann, applied for a Brazilian visa and was denied. And Thomas Mann was very upset about it. He felt that he should have gotten the visa. He had some claim to it, and but beyond that, I really don't know if this was actually even broached as a possibility. I would suspect not, but that's certainly a really good question. He never went to Brazil. That's for sure. So, and he writes about it with regret. He says, "I'm sorry. I mean, I'm sorry that I didn't do that."
Any more questions? Last question? And I would like to close the discussion, and we can continue talking in a more informal setting. Thank you so much for coming.